StarCraft 1 was my second PC game, and my first love. I played the game like many diehards in most of Korea for many years after it and Brood War's launch. It was the first game that I played for a full 24 hours straight, with my beloved grandma greeting me in the morning as I zombied on in custom games. So when I got the chance to play the sequel, StarCraft 2, sometime in the alpha of 2009, I was beside myself to figure out the latest and greatest tech, strategies, and cheeses, my personal favorite. And while Reapers were OP back then and many other things, the game really looked like another chance to play a favorite RTS title for many more years. But despite my enjoyment of StarCraft 2 and my many years and hours of playing the game, reaching Master Tier at the peak just a few years back, it never really quite felt the same way as StarCraft 1 did, nor did I play it as long. And while some might say, well, that's just nostalgia speaking, or that it doesn't have to feel the same, and those are certainly a factor and valid, but what I find with StarCraft 2 is a much shorter reign, and a less successful general permeation into the culture of gaming as a title. What you realize while navigating the timeline of events that unfold as the videos do, however, is that StarCraft 2, which did launch to near universal acclaim back in 2010, could have been much more. But due to a combination of changes in design, developer-publisher mistakes, and StarCraft 2 has found itself less played than its much older brother. Worse, as of late, it has only received 1 or 2 community updates yearly for the past 3 years. That's why I'm covering it in the Death of a Game series, a series where we navigate the said timeline of events in an attempt to spot and collect the clues and bits of evidence, so we can solve the case of what is and are the largest contributing factors to the game's death or demise. This all culminates to a final deduction, every detective's favorite, where we put the case back in the cabinet and move on to the next. The story begins coming off the success of StarCraft's Brood War expansion in 1998 and Warcraft 3's expansion Frozen Throne in 2003. Blizzard had been dominating the RTS genre, even with stiff competition in Command & Conquer and Age of Empires for easily 6 years. This was on top of their mega success that they were reaching with World of Warcraft later in 2004. Blizzard at this point couldn't do anything wrong and was seen as both one of the most talented development teams and yet one of the most trustworthy at the same time. StarCraft was big in the West, but in the East, especially in South Korea, the game had become a cultural icon, a sport, a way of life for many pros and aspiring pros. The pressure to create a new StarCraft game was strong globally, but no region more that Blizzard wanted to impress than Korea, which despite being a smaller country had become both the best and most played players in StarCraft 1 history. This can be seen in how StarCraft 2 was announced to the world, announced nowhere other than Korea. Blizzard's team would take the stage in Seoul, Korea at the Olympic gymnastics stage. Mike Morhaime, the then president of Blizzard, Rob Pardo, the lead director on development, and the writer and designer Chris Metzen greeted and thanked fans for coming out and watching the announcement to come. Then the pros of StarCraft 1 and Warcraft 3 would take the stage and introduce themselves as well. After that, Mike Morhaime would take the stage yet again, thanking the Korean fans for their enthusiasm, before welcoming in the new trailer for their upcoming game, a sequel, StarCraft 2. And the crowd, literally this time, went wild. With the announcement would be the reveal of who the lead designer on the project was as well. They would be none other than the former Command & Conquer developer, as well as the developer and lead designer on Battle for Middle-earth, Dustin Broder. This would end up being a pretty pivotal change, as James Finney was no longer involved in the project, which would end up signaling 2 major changes going forward: the campaign and the pacing and focus of the multiplayer competitive game. News of StarCraft 2 erupted on the internet, and some StarCraft 1 fans like myself were still playing the game and got these rumbles while playing the game. The biggest questions were going to be, how would the game look, and how would it play? And some of these questions would be answered in 2007 when Rob Pardo would be interviewed concerning StarCraft 2. Rob outlined that with StarCraft 2, Blizzard was going back to its roots to make a true sequel, where resource management will be more central to gameplay and there will be less micromanagement of different units with special abilities. I find this interesting, because basically it contrasts with, from the sounds of it, with StarCraft 1. Which would be those roots, right? But maybe he's referring to the fact that Warcraft has a lot more abilities. Rob would also express a desire to make all-out rushing more viable. The most surprising, at least for modern Blizzard or Activision Blizzard fans to read or hear, is that Rob was expressing the skill difference in the game as being a part of the game's main expression. Rob would even state that in StarCraft 2 there would be more pronounced skill levels and more nuance in high-level play. Rob was basically promising that the game would be niche, at least in a sense. But due to how large the RTS genre was, and how successful Blizzard was with their titles in it, they really believed, I think, that they could crack that ceiling. Or just maybe they didn't know what that ceiling was yet. Blizzard, which was owned by Vivendi Games in a never-before-expected move, would be purchased by Activision for an at-the-time unprecedented $19 billion. Activision Blizzard would be formed, which would spark a huge downturn of quality for the company at large, and a slew of harassment cases and, later, a lawsuit. That's the funny thing about corporations with art, or video games in this case. They can make money off of the momentum they previously had when the company was making and creating new art and innovating by cutting corners up to a point. This is why they have to have massive layoffs whenever things don't go according to plan, which has plagued Blizzard, for example, now known as Activision Blizzard, for many years after the fact. But I guess the point is, after the well runs dry, you have to come up with new innovation and new moves, and make sure that you're keeping yourself modern. And well, fast forwarding a bit, Activision Blizzard never really did that past Overwatch, which was technically part of a former failed project from 2007. When a corporation, especially the size of Activision, acquires you, things are going to change. Blizzard might have been successful previously, but relative to others, they weren't the biggest company, which would now nearly change overnight. Expectations would grow as well, as now things would have to be that much more money-making to succeed. That means immediately you would notice changes, and those changes were felt with StarCraft 2, with the announcement in 2009 that LAN mode would not be supported anymore. This means that you could no longer just plug in offline PCs with a copy of the game to get a tournament running and the game to work. While for many unaware fans it seemed like a bit of a non-starter, this was clearly a corporate move by Activision Blizzard to combat the rampant success of StarCraft 1 in Korea and other regions, and by combat I mean try to dip their toes in and make money off of things that they'd never put any effort in. To put simply, StarCraft 1 had outgrown Blizzard and blossomed to a massive esport hit in Korea without much or any of their help really at all. This led to the success of KESPA, or the Korean Esports Association, with their StarCraft League. The new user agreement, though, would mean that players would no longer own the game, which would mean that breaking the service could actually be actionable by law. Some fans, though, seeing right through the power grab by Activision Blizzard attempting to consolidate more power and control of their game, would review bomb the pre-order of the game. StarCraft 2 would launch July 27, 2010 and make rumbles unlike almost any other title that I have covered in the series thus far. On aggregate review website Metacritic from 80 different critics plus, StarCraft 2 would score a 93 out of 100 and reach universal acclaim. Nearly 1.5 million copies would be sold in just 2 days, and by the end of the year, they would sell over 4.5 million copies. This wasn't some cult classic scenario, where the game would score well but not sell that well. It was a fast-selling game and one of the fastest-selling RTSs ever. StarCraft 2 overnight had become one of the most played games and best-selling games of its genre. PC Gamer would score StarCraft 2 a 93 out of 100, calling the campaign gloriously well-crafted and the multiplayer an Olympic experience. The former being quite unique to Blizzard, making quality campaigns in RTS games, that is. But some cracks were shown when PC Gamer states that the best way of describing the joy of StarCraft 2 online is this: even if you win, you are usually left exhausted. The mental effort required to scout your opponent, match their economy, deliver a counter and execute a plan will leave you drained and broken. If you lose, the mental effort is the same, sometimes greater. And while they explain they also never left the game unhappy because of this, with all due respect, they never really put that much time into the game, as most of these reviews don't. Which means at some point, I can tell you from my many hundreds of hours of the game, and my easily 1,000+ hours in StarCraft 1, let me just tell you, at some point in losing efforts, you're going to get frustrated. Because the idea that you're always cognizant enough or aware enough to even learn from defeats or even know how you're losing just isn't true, even with VOD review. Game Informer gave the game a super impressive perfect score of 10 out of 10. They would express great admiration for the modern take on a classic RTS concept, the impressive graphics, especially for an RTS, and the high amount of replayability. There was so much to like and chew on with StarCraft 2. If you didn't love grinding on the uber competitive ranked ladders, you could always just do casual matches, or one of my favorites, Archon mode, where you share control with another player. And of course, matchmaking wasn't the only way to experience the game, just like StarCraft 1. Custom games would give birth to some of the coolest and most unique maps and game modes, some sprouting out of almost nowhere at launch because they were either made by experienced modders or built on classic mods. The only downside I think that you could argue with the gameplay options offered at launch with StarCraft 2 was the lack of custom campaigns for the time, or at least having the feature accessible, which would come later, and that there was quite the contrast between the custom games and the competitive ladder in StarCraft 1. This wasn't nearly as pronounced, with many custom competitive modes also present in lobbies. It's also worth mentioning that the problem in general with StarCraft and Warcraft as a series is that the single-player campaigns don't get you actually ready for multiplayer. And StarCraft 2, it just felt like that, at least for me personally, was a little bit more pronounced too. The death of StarCraft 2's LAN feature wouldn't be the only casualty in the new acquisition and Activision's new influence. Although often Blizzard was described as functioning separately from Activision, ironically, including from multiple reputable journalists, I've never really seen this to be true, and it doesn't really make sense for it to be true anyway. And even if I am being the utmost charitable about it, they still have a heavy level of influence over you anyway. It's not like you're working independently anymore or in a vacuum. Anyway, Activision Blizzard, in my opinion, would create a long-lasting blunder that still hurts StarCraft 2 today, and contributes to its non-existent competitive scene outside of official tournaments and a smaller scene than the previous title. Negotiations previously had been tense between Kespa and Blizzard, but were even worse after the Activision acquisition. They would be ultimately unable to negotiate the broadcast rights for StarCraft 2, and would choose to go with another competitor, GOM TV, instead. GOM TV was relatively new in the space, but had just recently held a very successful tournament and had some major talent involved. Kespa, of course, was the de facto biggest Korean tournament organizer, so losing them would not only hurt in the short term, it would greatly hurt the longevity of StarCraft 2 if the other series didn't pan out especially. Due to strained relations as well, many StarCraft 1 pros wouldn't even transition to StarCraft 2, whether because they worked with Kespa and were told not to, or because they just didn't trust the new changes in the unproven esport that StarCraft 2 was at the time. GOM TV was then put in charge and ran the StarCraft 2 tournament scene for 2 years to great success. Activision Blizzard started then organizing their own tournaments and competitions, probably wanting to get a piece of that pie. This would literally lead to counter-programming, with some GOM TV matches having nearly no viewers because of it, and some teams expressing great fatigue and having to pull out altogether from tournaments. This rapid-fire tournament organizing and counter-programming would lead to many tournament organizers having to pull out altogether. Most notably, IGN's Pro League, though StarCraft 2 wouldn't be the only reason that they folded, it was a major reason due to match-fixing scandals with Yoda. NASL and MLG would also stop hosting StarCraft 2 tournaments too, which was just another dagger. Sometimes having more competition for tournaments is good. See the Counter-Strike scene for many years. But when you're organizing league structures and needing players to play dozens of games, it can just lead to more fatigue. We were running into issues with scheduling or conflicts. Players and tournament scheduling was very much out of our control. There were conflicts and we weren't getting the best StarCraft we could. There was viewer and player fatigue. The first expansion would be announced November 2012, set for the following year. Heart of the Swarm, featuring the Zerg faction and their queen, Kerrigan, would launch March 12th, 2013, and like most StarCraft or Warcraft expansions, not just add more campaign, but actually add new units to the multiplayer and end up changing the very meta of the game. Heart of the Swarm would sell 1.1 million copies in a jiffy, proving that StarCraft 2 was still around to be a major player. Though to be clear, I think this is worth mentioning, the original game sold for X that, so it's not a total buy-in from the original buyers. After the success, the game had a massive stage set, and then completely bunted on things with the new units like the Swarm host, most importantly. That's because although Brood War added nice wrinkles to StarCraft 1 in its competitive scene, StarCraft 2 with its new expansion nearly rewrote the meta and pacing of the game. The game was now tremendously slowed down, with one professional game most famously lasting hours before one pro just decided to start browsing Reddit, and then that got him forfeited, and they ended the match. The Swarm host, and the problem with it at the time, was that it allowed you to siege with very little recourse, absurdly powerfully. More importantly at the time, the Locusts themselves would spawn on 1-to-1 cooldowns, making them far more potent than in modern times, because in modern times they're more used as hit and run. While this would be changed later on, the amount of times matches would be derailed, including at the pro level by this and the Nidus Worm combo, was enormous. More importantly, it developed a meta that many players just weren't happy about, and when metas get developed, they often skew in the other direction too. MMM, or Marine Medic Marauder, became a favorite of many Terran players at the time, who would use it as a counter to people rushing Swarm, and then use it to bully players like me, who had very weak Protoss early games. HOTS just wasn't really a good competitive meta for the game, which really hurt their competitive scene. After seeing the success of GSL in Korea, Blizzard would mimic this for their other regions and erect a global league of their own, dubbing it the World Championship Series. They would also team up with Afrika TV and GSL and likely have them help run the tournaments in Korea, and assert more control. I'm just kidding. The WCS was supposed to be a global circuit, but Activision Blizzard would make the interesting decision, or blunder depending on your opinion, to allow players to choose what region they wanted to compete in. This would force South Korean players, the overwhelmingly most successful region and professional set of players, to choose to compete in a new region for easier competition and money, or stay with a safer bet in their own region. Activision Blizzard would then add WCS points, which could be earned by placing at WCS events or third-party ones. The problem being that naturally the most points would be for attending the WCS events, which would mean that the most successful teams would just be the ones that could afford to have their players travel the most. Most famously, Evil Geniuses had Jaedong travel like an absurd amount for tournaments at this time. By 2014 at the Global Finals, no foreigners would even qualify at all, and the two most popular Western players, Idra and Stefano, would both retire, citing that the game was the reason why. You have to think, things get worse when you have top Korean players in your region, because now they're dominating you before you ever get a chance to actually improve to be able to fight them. After 2014, the competitive scene globally started to really just jump off a cliff. Activision Blizzard was effectively killing their own tournament organizers more and more. The prize pool also had in total shrunk about 25% overall, and many tournaments had just simply started shutting down altogether. StarCraft 2 was just getting passed up competitively by other things, like MOBAs, like Dota and League of Legends, which was ironic because StarCraft and Warcraft gave birth to the MOBA genre. But MOBAs had the benefit of only having you control one unit, a hero unit, which greatly would simplify the macro and microplay required, as well as just general awareness. In MOBAs, the macro becomes more about playing with your teammates. While the competitive scene was already faltering between 2013 and 2014, things would really hit the fan in 2015, when the game's general player base would also suffer and the viewership had just disappeared. While I usually point to failed esport endeavors for multiplayer titles as a way to point out poorly weighed priorities, in the case of StarCraft 2, it was actually more dire than that. The game was basically built to be competitive, and if that didn't work, the game wouldn't really work. Even some of the most iconic figures of the game, like Day 9, would depart for greener pastures. Activision Blizzard would put part of the blame on their inability to keep up with their competitors, but claim they were still focused on fixing what they could, such as the region locking and an increase in the prize pool. Also, while 2015 was the death of esports in StarCraft 2 for many, it was a large resurgence for none other than its older brother Brood War. The final expansion for StarCraft 2, Legacy of the Void, featured my favorite Protoss faction and would be announced in September of 2015. It would then launch November 10th, 2015, and yet again sell over 1 million copies just about, almost overnight. Unfortunately though, the campaign itself technically at this point had taken 5 years to complete, which contributed, at least I think, to some people feeling disconnected from the plot at this point, as well as just a generally weaker received plot. Although some enjoy the plot in StarCraft 2, as it's much simpler, the issue is that it suffers from a lot of just inconsistencies, and worse, it lacks what made the first game so special, which was the beautiful nuance and gray zones the game and world operated within. Still, Legacy of the Void was largely received well, but part of the problem it seemed with StarCraft 2 was that, especially this late into its run, was that the game did a poor job of attracting new players, and the ones that it did attract, it did a poor job of keeping them. This is a bit of the elephant in the room anytime you talk about StarCraft 2. The game has an incredibly high skill cap. As someone who hit Master Tier myself, I can actually tell you very confidently, I only scratched the surface personally. I've played GMs who have skunked me. Now imagine what pros and the best pros are doing to me. But while many successful games have high skill caps, the issue with StarCraft 2 was that the custom game community was actually pretty small, and the game itself required more than just high levels of skill, but absurd decision making, mechanics, and macro and micro domination. StarCraft 2 is so difficult for new players to play, and I know firsthand because I have spoken to many of my friends and tried to drag them into the game. One of the #1 issues is that it's hard to improve when you just can't improve at one thing and really get far. Like, you can't just improve at mechanics or macro ability. In StarCraft 2, you have to realistically improve at both, past a point, which is just difficult. Contrast this to StarCraft 1, where you could get by on mechanics a lot more just alone. StarCraft 2, led by Dustin Broder of Command & Conquer fame, had far more of a focus as a game on macro-level plays. While this might sound better and more attractive to casual players, in a sense, it's not, because it requires you yet another skill to master, on top of the snowballiness of StarCraft 2 in general. Because resources are so important, if you fail an all-in or fail a rush or just didn't expand fast enough, in some instances you basically auto-lose past a certain rank due to just math and, well, economics. There's a lot less in comeback mechanics in StarCraft 2 as well. Now, some of the reasons for that are unavoidable, like the AI and mechanic codes in StarCraft 1 being so unique to the game and the fact that it was ancient and had a really weird engine, right? Think about the Dragoons and shit. But others were self-inflicted in the case of the design, and even in the case of some of the previous mechanics becoming just more automated. In a strange sense, StarCraft 2 has a very comparable APM requirement to StarCraft 1, especially if you factor in the amount of macro on top of things. StarCraft 1 also has inflated APM numbers because people can do things like select all of their minions and then have to divide their units up due to limits. I'm sort of confused about what the approach with StarCraft 2 was in the end, because they ended up with a game that in many ways is harder than StarCraft 1, and I don't really know if that was the path. Contrast this to Age of Empires as a series and it doesn't really seem to match at all, which, by the way, many StarCraft and Warcraft fans seem to forget about. And not just the newest game, but AoE 2 has a bigger population than probably both StarCrafts combined. And they did it with constant updates, belief in the design, and a thriving, open, competitive scene. Now, one really successful aspect of LOTV as an expansion was the co-op missions. These allowed players to team up and find many novel ways to finish a number of unique missions and tasks. These were, in my opinion, easily the most successful aspect of StarCraft 2 unique creations from the developers, and brought the most players back to the game in my experience, and from testimonies. Activision Blizzard would release some new co-op missions periodically, a few a year between 2015 and 2017, and in many cases it was not just new missions, but also new heroes to choose from. But the biggest tragedy with the co-op missions is that so many players who would love them or love to play them, who played StarCraft 2 or never did, won't ever get the chance because how much of a negative stigma surrounds the game in general. I think the next RTS to leverage co-op missions from the beginning will excel greatly because of this. In a confusing turn of events, at least for me, that stealth ghost game that was teased for decades but cancelled finally came out. I'm just kidding, but sort of. A new mission pack was released March 29th, 2016. For $20, you could play as Nova, a ghost, on a number of missions. While many diehards will defend this mission pack, it basically offered 1/4 the value of an actual expansion for basically the same price. Not to mention, although I think the story is probably better than the base story of the game, I don't think that's exactly saying much. And it doesn't really do much to expand the actual game or plot in any serious ways. According to a couple of sources, Activision Blizzard was finding it difficult to monetize StarCraft 2 in general, especially with basically nobody else following the multiple paid expansion formula anymore. This would probably have a major influence on their next major move. StarCraft 2, 7 years after launch, would go free-to-play November 2017. This would make the game free-to-play online, with the single-player campaigns having to be purchased separately. The transition would easily inject a major amount of players, new and returning, back to StarCraft 2, me being one of those. Activision Blizzard would also launch the War Chest, which was kind of their version of the Valve Codex or Battle Pass, and this would allow players to assist in funding the competitive scene while also getting some cool unlocks. The first War Chest was so successful it actually contributed $200,000 to BlizzCon. At this point, the competitive scene was in a slightly better spot, but not much better to be honest. Tournaments, teams, and prize pools nearly across the board had dropped, and most of Korea was actually playing StarCraft 1. Reportedly, this change made StarCraft 2 more money than a full expansion in sales did, which sort of tackles another of our major issues. Activision Blizzard almost arrogantly would defy most gaming conventions with StarCraft 2. Most importantly, they felt that they were able to sell a battle chest expansion format previously, and that they could do it again. The problem is that it put a heavy barrier to entry, aka the cost, which in a strange way keeps you from making money off of players who can't make the larger purchases or need to be more bought in to do such. StarCraft and Warcraft literally birthed the MOBA genre, a genre that is entirely free to play, and one that has no paid expansions, which sort of makes it ironic in a sense that MOBAs were able to eclipse RTSs so easily. But when your game already has a high barrier to entry, aka just learning how to play it, maybe had they actually gone free to play early on, at least twice as fast, things could have gone much differently. The final co-op mission would drop June 2018, and I think that this quite clearly shows how little love and content StarCraft 2 would receive from this point on. They were able to coast off of the success of the free-to-play and co-op missions. While the World Championship Series carried on in multiple iterations for over half a decade too, it would come to an end sometime near the end of 2019, to make way for a new tournament series. I saw this though as Activision Blizzard no longer really wanting to be involved in things themselves, probably because it just wasn't as worth it to them anymore. Blizzard would cut a deal for StarCraft 2 and Warcraft 3 with DreamHack/ESL and create the new ESL Pro Tour for both. Activision Blizzard would offer up nearly $2 million in prize pooling, but as I've stated in my previous Overwatch videos, just throwing money at a prize pool does nothing to solve the epistemic issues. It doesn't bring in any new players, and it does really fuck all to attract most old players. It doesn't build the infrastructure and support that all sports or esports need to succeed. 2021 would have only one update, and although many at the time would blame COVID for the reason, that's not the case, and I'll explain why later. From this point on, StarCraft 2 seems to get put into maintenance mode. The next year, things would ramp up slightly to 3 total updates, but only 2 of them had any substance, and they were actually pitched and designed by the community themselves anyway. And while this is cool and admirable, and I actually like this, and I think it makes sense in an older online game, again, it doesn't do fuck all to really keep the game alive. I mean, Final Fantasy XI, and even an actual RTS like AoE 2 or Age of Empires 2 are like 20 years old and get far more updates and content. The next year, and we were back to just one community balance update, 2024, and we don't have a single update yet, and the year is half over. Now, the ESL Pro League was still running, in a shrunken form than from before, but sadly, StarCraft 2 is nowhere near at its peak, let alone the years after that, and while many of the barely any remaining fans will tell me in the comments, or on Reddit in their echo chambers, what about this oil money/monarchy Middle Eastern washing tournaments esports World Cup? But honestly, just go watch Richard Lewis's videos about it and how it basically seems like a vacuum tournament, meaning it seems to pretty much exist in a vacuum, with a super large prize pool out of nowhere and an event that seems to have an over-focus on advertisers over building or supporting the StarCraft 2 scene itself. This doesn't do anything to help the game or support the scene really, except just make a spectacle out of what remains and paying some hungry pros. This is why it doesn't really feel controversial to feature StarCraft 2 in my series. Not only does it qualify as a game that has had a mass exodus and never recovered, it had multiple issues that contributed to the game never reaching the heights that it could have, which is crazy to think about. And finally, StarCraft 2 is and was clearly abandoned by Activision Blizzard, with nearly no major updates in the past 6 years, and only a few updates in the past few. This is a shame, because much like Warcraft 3 was shafted in the Reforged version, which has greatly hurt that game in its scene, which I covered already, so go check it out, StarCraft 2 is arguably doing worse, because as a series it doesn't have the added benefit of being also a massively successful virtual world. The last expansion came out 9 years ago. I know, feels. The future for StarCraft 2 seems pretty much written. But the future for StarCraft as a franchise seems even more bleak, because even though StarCraft 1 had a remaster that did okay, it seemed to do little to persuade Activision Blizzard to do anything more than that. With that music playing, we have gathered enough clues and reached the end of the timeline. That means it's time to crack the case, detectives, and for those who missed it, why did StarCraft 2 fail and what kept it from reaching even more greatness? Activision Blizzard fumbled the competitive scene, built a more niche game, punishing learning curve, lived in the shadow of the previous title, infrequent updates and support, an outdated business model. Well, it was abandoned. But nerdSlayer, I don't watch your series or videos period, or long enough to learn what they're even about, so how the heck is StarCraft 2, a game that's supported by a megacorp that receives a few updates every 4 years and has an inflated recent tournament edition, dead? Well, death doesn't only have one definition, and if you think that that's me obfuscating or trying to create some other type of narrative, literally learn about words and definitions, guys. Anyway, you're a massive dolt if you don't know that, and you type that shit in the comments especially. Now anyway, don't you think it's a little bit odd that the older StarCraft 1, which is over 24 years old, gets more play than the newer one? Now, this is clearly a personal story to me, but even if it is a personal one, it doesn't mean that I'm going to tell a delusional version of that story. No, StarCraft 2 isn't doing well, and the StarCraft series is not doing well at large either, and I don't really know at this point if we will ever see another StarCraft project, which is pretty sad for me, not gonna lie. That's why it's important for me to tell this story, so people realize it was major blunders that allowed the de facto RTS giant and a lot of complacency to fall so far. It's played less than the 2 games that are 10 years older than it in the same genre. Thanks for watching.
Well, this is a fine mess we've gotten ourselves into.